Hey fellow gliders, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at how to use date math to make some interesting conditions and functionality in your app. Now let me dispel this right away. Yes, we're talking about math, right? But I think that this is actually going to be pretty interesting, and you're going to see some interesting use cases where we can do some simple calculations and also some brute force text strings in order to make some interesting values occur with dates in order to make the functionality you're looking for possible within Glide. Now, dealing with dates and times is one of the trickiest things you can do with software development, but the premise of this video is just to show you some of the tools that Glide has to offer and how to manipulate time and dates accordingly. So the premise of this app is going to be something very, very simple use case. A user can submit a rating or an assessment, and they're only allowed to submit so many assessments within a certain block of time, which means we need to calculate how much time it's been since their last assessment before they can do their next assessment. So here I have a simple form for assessments, and in the data editor, under the assessments tab, I have some simple columns: who's filling out the form, when they filled it out, what the rating is, and any comments that they might have left. And then we need to take a look at this timestamp to see when they can next make the next assessment. Now, again, this is completely arbitrary, and it really just depends upon your use case here, but I'm going to show you a few different ways to calculate that next date. All right, first let's go ahead and fill out our form. Let's give it a 5 stars. Wonderful job. Okay, and we hit submit. Now you see that right away it lets us create a new form because we don't have any restrictions on this button press here. But eventually want to say, maybe you have a banner at the top that says your next available assessment is within blank time period, and then not allow them to click the button. All right, one of the first ways that we can set a future date is through just natural language. I could say something like 6 months from now, now being the time that they submitted the form. And so all you would need is a date time column. And when you go to complete the form, you literally type in 6 months from now, and it'll generate an exact timestamp 6 months from the time that was entered. Now, Glide recognizes this as a legit date and time. If you were to dive into the actual data feeding this, it's still that string value. Kind of interesting. You can do a whole lot with this, right? I could say next week. I could say last week, right? And you get an actual date time, which is pretty cool. So if I wanted to do this as part of the form, what I would have to do is actually use an onSubmit action with this, because there's no way to set a custom value of 6 months from now, unless it existed somewhere in like your users table that you could pull from. That's one way to do it. I could create a user column and just call it 6 months from now. And it's just a template column. And I'll literally just type that in so it populates it down the row. You know, I like to keep my data in my data editor relevant to actual data and not some sort of like tricky kind of things like this. But this is one way to do it without any additional updates. So now when I complete my form, I can add in that user value, this 6 months from now, and have it go to that new column. And so now when I fill out my form, it'll automatically fill in that date and time, like so. So that's one way to approach it. Another way to approach it would be when you're filling out the form, you have an onSubmit action that's doing a set column value. And in that new column, you type out 6 months from now. Now, the benefit of doing it this way is that you don't have any additional columns taking up space in your data table. However, it does require an extra update for every single form that gets filled out. Now, the next step I'm going to show you is using a math column to calculate the next date. So it just depends upon how far out you want to go. If you want to only go a day out to prevent them from doing something, you actually don't need any math calculation at all. You can actually just use an if-then-else column. And when I choose an if-then-else column, I can see if it's today. And we can check to see if the timestamp is within today, then, true, else false. And then we can, in the users table, we can create a query and we'll say filled out today, where the source is the assessments, and we're going to filter where the owner of that assessment is this row's email, right? But also where if today is checked, right? And here we can see that this person already filled out a form for today because it has a match here. And if there is a match, if there's a relation, if this query is not empty, then we can prevent them from filling out that button. Right? That's one way to do it if you're just working within a singular day. But let's say they're only able to fill out the form once per week, so every 7 days. Right? Well, then this doesn't work anymore because our if then else condition doesn't have that option of is within today kind of thing. So a couple of ways to make that happen. All right, so the first thing here is using a math column to calculate that next day. So I can come over here to my math column and I'll say, let's pretend it's 7 days. So 7 days from timestamp. When you're doing math calculations on a date, you simply just type in a variable that's going to represent that date. So here I can just type the word date, for example, and we can replace the word date with the timestamp. So again, it's just a replication of that column. But now we can actually do some calculations on it. So if I want to add 7 days, I just add 7. And now we see that our next timestamp is June 30th, right? So now my if then else column can look at this timestamp instead. And I can say if this week. And I can say if the timestamp, not the timestamp, if the 7 days from the timestamp is after today, meaning it's still in the future because I've already filled out something now, then true, else false, right? But let's say I filled this out a week ago. Okay, now this is false, because our timestamp June 22nd, that happened yesterday. And so now we have a condition here that lets us fill out the form. Now this works really well when you're dealing with just days. You're only giving them a 30-day window or a 90-day window. But if you want to make it specifically 1 month or 6 months or 1 year, this logic doesn't quite work because you can't just say plus 30 because some months don't have just 30 days and some have less than 30 days. So you're never going to get an accurate month-to-month value here. You also can't do a year out. If I say 365, right? Well, June 15th, 1 year from June 15th is actually June 15th of 2024, not June 14th. So could say date 365.25, but all that does is change the time. It doesn't change the actual date. And you can't say 366 because sometimes those dates won't line up correctly. So that being said, this method is also a little trickier. So if you wanted to add a certain amount of months to a particular date, there's 2 ways you can make this happen. One uses a lot of columns, but it's all no code. And the other method is using a little bit of code, but then it only uses 2 columns. So let me show you the first way. So the first step is breaking out this timestamp into multiple parts, the days, the months, and the years. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new math column, and I'll call this days. And we take the day of the timestamp, and we see that now we have just the day value. And for this, I'm doing precision 1 with no group separator, just to kind of keep our data looking clean here. Okay, I'm not going to duplicate this. I'm going to call this months. And we're going to do the month of the timestamp. Same display. Okay, so that's our June. And then I'm going to get the year. So that's our 2023. All right, now if we want to add 6 months to this value, all we need to do is add 6. So I can do months plus 6. It's going to be a math column. Okay, and now we see that the next month will be December 12th. Now this works really well when our timestamp is anywhere from January to June, months 1 through 6. Because the next month is still within the same calendar year. The problem is what happens when our timestamp goes to that next month, like July? Okay, from here on, 6 months out, well, there is no 13th month of the year. And the next year would be 2024, not 2023. So we need a way to make this month go back to 1 because it's January. And if it's more than 12, we need to add a year to our years in order to get the correct time of January 15th, 2024. Now, there are a few no-code ways to convert this arrangement of days, months, and years to an actual date. One of them is using an Excel formula, believe it or not. So I can come into our columns, and underneath the other columns at the bottom here, you can come to code and then Excel formula. And you can type in a formula here that will actually convert your days, months, and years to a date string. So that formula is the date formula. And I can do date, open parenthesis, and then I have to supplement some variables, A1, A2, and A3. A1 being the years, A2 being the months, and A3 being the days. And then I can come over here to A1 and say years. A2 will be the months plus 6. What's nice about this is that it can read months past 12. So we have 13 months right now. It'll recognize that and actually add the correct month and the correct year to the date string. All right, so months plus 6, and then the days. Now, the only tricky thing is that this outputs a date value, but we want a text string value to actually make it look like a date. So we have to wrap this date formula with a text formula. So I'll say text, open parenthesis, and then after this date formula, we'll hit a comma, and then we specify the format. So if we're doing month, day, year, we do quote, month, month, day, day, year, 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 like this. And now we see we have an actual date. Okay. Now the issue with this date is that it's a string, meaning we can't do any sort of date calculations on this. We can't say, oh, if this is in the future, if this is after today, right? So unlike the 7 days from timestamp, if I wanted to do that same logic with this if then else, this new column here, I don't get those date operators because it thinks it's just text, not a date. So we have to convert this value into a date. All right, so this is 6 months, and this is in Excel, okay? Now, typically when it comes to doing Excel formulas, I like to stay away from them at all costs, especially if those formulas are within inside of a Google Sheet, because there's latency from when that formula calculates to that data actually hitting glide and showing up in your app. But if you're using the Excel formula column, it actually calculates instantly. So I have no qualms about using a formula like this, especially dealing with dates, just because Excel has some really nice date kind of operation formulas. All right, now that we have this string value, we need to convert it to an actual date column so that way we can do some calculations on it and use it with our conditions of this checkbox here. So the column that we need is the to date column. It's the last column in our operation here. It's under the other section, date and time, and then we see text to date. And what's really cool about this column is that you can specify any text you want. So in this case, it's going to be our months Excel. And then all you do is you specify the format. So ours is month, month, day, day, year, year. So that's month, month, slash day, day, slash year, 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 year. Right? And we do that. Now we can specify here the parts and the date formatting and so forth. So if we want only the date, we can do that. If we want just the time, we could do that. If we want date and time, we can format it as long or short, right? However we want to display it. All right, let's name this 6 months date value. And now that because this is an actual date that we can leverage for conditions, back in our if then else column, if we were to switch to that column, you'll see that we get our date time operators again. All right, so that's how I would go about approaching doing months calculation. There are some more trickier like math columns that you could probably leverage to make it all one singular month column or math column, but it requires a very, very complicated formula. This is just much more straightforward in my opinion. Now, the last thing you can do to create some complicated date logic when you're adding and calculating is to actually go low code. So if you know a little bit of JavaScript, you can actually leverage the JavaScript column and create this month right off the bat without having to break it apart into days and months and that kind of thing. So here's how I would go about approaching it. Because JavaScript is still kind of new to me, I like to leverage ChatGPT as often as I can. So I'll say, create JavaScript that calculates 6 months from a date input. Okay, it's going to give me some JavaScript. All right, so I'm going to take this code, copy it, come over to my Glide app, and create a new JavaScript column. I'm going to paste that code inside of the JavaScript code block. And we need a date input. And we have a variable here, P1. So P1 will be the timestamp here. And what we're going to do is we're going to specify, or we're going to convert. So Glide does not want console logs, it wants return values. So we'll say return updated date, like that, where our date input is not this specific string, but rather it's our variable P1. Okay, so actually it did convert it just fine. All right, if I hit done, we see our timestamp here, July 15th, and our JavaScript was 1 month, or sorry, 6 months later. So then all we would have to do is convert this back to a date using our 6 months date value, but then point it to our JavaScript column and give it the correct format. So our format here is year, month, day. So we just need to swap things around, year, dash, month, dash, day. And now we have that exact same date value here that we can leverage in our if then else column. All right, so the last thing we need to do is just give our users a little display to let them know when they can next fill out the form. So we're going to do some friendly dates here. I'm going to create one more column, and under the other date and time, we have this relative time, which is kind of nice. I'm going to click on relative time, and the date is going to be our 6 months date value. And here we can see in 7 months or in 6 months is when they can next complete that time. I'm going to hit done. And then we just can add this to a template column. So we'll call this display template. And in our template, we can start off with a little bit of text, like next available assessment. And then with the variable, I like to use numbers, 1, where 1 stands for that new column. And now we see like the next available assessment in 7 months, in 6 months, that kind of thing. And that's what we display. So we just create a condition on this action. So come over here to our actions, right? And we're actually gonna enable advanced actions. And we're gonna convert just this form screen add action to a create new action. It retains that form, which is awesome. But we're going to check to see whether or not the user profile filled out today, or I guess you filled out today, is empty. If it's empty, that means that it was not filled out in that time period. So they can show the form. Otherwise, we're going to show notification. And that notification is going to be of the next time, which we need to grab from our user profile. So we're going to use a single value column for that. And we're going to get the first from the filled out display, right? And that's what we're going to display in our action. Let's name this assessment or notification. Okay, so Because I've already filled one out, when I hit the button, next bill has been in 7 months. So as you can see, dealing with dates can be a bit tricky, but Glide gives us a few columns to make things work very efficiently. Also, just to recap, in order to deal with conditions and time using an if then else or a filter, Glide has to recognize that the time or the date is inside of an actual date time column, being a date time column, a math column, or that text to date column. If you have any questions at all about how I set things up or anything specific to what you're trying to calculate, feel free to leave me a comment below. You can also reach out to me at Twitter at @rpetito. And as always, thanks for watching.